We're looking at Mary as the Ark of the Covenant. And in the first segment, we considered how the Ark of the Covenant played an important role in Israel's history, carrying the Ten Commandments, the manna, the staff of Aaron, the high priest, but most of all carrying the holy presence of God, and then being used also not just for worship, but also for warfare in in the battles that Israel was fighting in the Old Testament. Then we considered in 2 Samuel 6 this important journey the Ark of the Covenant took. As David sets up his capital city in Jerusalem, he orders the Ark of the Covenant to be brought up to Jerusalem. And this is at a pivotal moment in Israel's history as David is about to be given the great dynasty and the covenant promises of an everlasting kingdom. And in that moment, the Ark plays an important role. Now, what I'd like to do is turn our attention, with this Old Testament background about the Ark, I'd like to turn our attention to the New Testament and look at how, as the dawn of the Messiah is coming, as the Messiah is just conceived in Mary's womb, the Messianic age is now here, and the kingdom is about to be built, we're going to see Mary playing a very important role at this pivotal moment in the kingdom's history. Let's take a look at the scene of the visitation. And I want you to, we've read a little bit of the scene in previous episodes, and I want to go back and look at some things now in light of this background of 2 Samuel chapter 6. And I want you to, as we read along, think about how this might remind us of some things that happened in the Old Testament with the Ark in 2 Samuel 6. So we turn to Luke chapter 1, verse 39. And Kevin, if you could read for us verses 39 through 42.
In those days, Mary rose and went with haste into the hill country, to a city of Judah. She entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the babe leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. She exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb."
And Kevin, could you read verse 43 as well?
Sure. "And why is this granted me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me?"
All right. Now I ask all of you, what are some things that you see happening here with Mary as she goes on this journey to visit Elizabeth that might remind you of what happened with the Ark of the Covenant of old?
Well, from the beginning, she arose. We saw the word arose back in 2 Samuel also, and went to the hill country, all Judah, that we saw back in the Old Testament.
Okay, excellent. So underlined in chapter 1, verse 39, it says, Mary arose, and she went with haste to the hill country. So notice she arose and went to the hill country of Judah, just like David arose and went to the hill country of Judah to get the ark. All right, what's another thing we may notice here?
When Mary comes and visits Elizabeth, Elizabeth says, "Why is this granted me that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" Just as David said, "How can the ark come to me in Jerusalem?"
Okay, excellent. Remember when David was about to bring the ark up, he feared the Lord and then put a pause on the journey and said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" He said that in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Here now, notice, Elizabeth feels this maybe this holy awe and wonder over Mary coming to her and says, "And why is it granted to me that the mother of my Lord may come unto me?" Echoing David's response, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" Very good. What's another thing that we might notice here that reminds us of what happened to the ark of old?
It says in verse 41 that the babe leapt in her womb, and that kind of reminds us of David when he leapt and danced before the Ark of the Covenant.
All right, just as David was leaping and dancing before the Ark of the Covenant, so now the baby in Elizabeth's womb is leaping for joy before the presence of Mary, who's bringing the presence of Christ. John the Baptist in Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy as Mary comes. She's like the new Ark of the Covenant, carrying the presence of God in her own womb, Jesus Christ. All right, there are a few other things that we could look at here. First of all, let's take a look at what happens in verse 40 and 56 I want to look at. Where does the ark go? Or I'm sorry, where does Mary go? Mary goes to the hill country of Judah, and she's going to enter a house. She's going to enter the house of Zechariah. We saw the ark of old went to the house of Obed-Edom. Now Mary is going to the house of Zechariah. And who remembers how long the Ark of the Covenant stayed at the house of Obed-Edom?
3 months.
For 3 months. Well, guess how long Mary ends up staying at the house of Zechariah, serving her kinswoman Elizabeth? Verse 56 tells us the answer. And what's that?
3 months.
3 months.
3 months. What a coincidence. No, there's no coincidences with God, right? So we see so many parallels here. Notice, just as David arose and went to the hill country of Judah, so Mary arose and went to the hill country of Judah. Just as David said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So Elizabeth says to Mary, why is it granted to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me? Just as the ark went to the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months, so Mary goes to the house of Zechariah for 3 months. And just as David greeted the ark with great leaping and dancing, so we see here in Luke chapter 1, John the Baptist leaping before Mary. And it's the same word in Greek that's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament describing David leaping is used here to describe the baby in Elizabeth's womb, John, leaping for joy. But what I think is the most profound connection between the Ark of old and Mary is a little word that might go unnoticed by most, and that's in verse 42. But I don't want it to go unnoticed by you. Look at verse 42. It says that Elizabeth exclaimed with a loud cry. Circle that word. That's probably the most important word to make this parallel between the Ark of the Covenant and Mary. Because it says Elizabeth exclaimed with a loud cry. That word in Greek is anaphoneo. Anaphoneo. That word, anaphoneo, is only used one time in the entire New Testament. There are many ways to describe exclaiming. But this is the only time we see this particular word used to describe someone exclaiming or shouting out with a loud cry. So Luke must be thinking of something specific here, a certain kind of exclaiming, a certain kind of shouting, when he chooses deliberately this particular word that is nowhere used in the rest of the New Testament. When we turn to the Old Testament and we look at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, we see that this word anaphoneo is only used about 5 times. And every one of those occasions when the word anaphoneo is used, it's used to describe not any ordinary shouting or exclaiming. It's used to describe specifically Levitical priests praising God before the Ark of the Covenant. Anaphoneo describes Levitical priests praising God before the Ark of the Covenant. And so it's fitting here that Elizabeth is described as exclaiming, anaphoneo. She's exclaiming with a loud cry before Mary, the new Ark of the Covenant. And what really makes this connection so beautiful is when you consider who Elizabeth is. Anaphoneo was used to describe Levitical priests praising God before the Ark. But guess where Mary or Elizabeth comes from? What kind of family does she come from? Does anyone remember?
Isn't it a priestly family?
She's from a priestly family, which would mean she's from the family of Levi. And so here you have a member of the Levite family praising God before Mary, the new Ark of the Covenant. So what does this tell us about Mary? Well, think about it. If the Ark of the Covenant carried the manna of the Old Testament, then it's fitting that Mary is the new Ark of the Covenant because in her womb she carries Jesus Christ, who is described in John chapter 6 as the new manna, the bread that came down from heaven, the bread of life. And just as the Ark of the Covenant carried the 10 Commandments written on stone, so now Mary carries the child in her womb who is the fulfillment of the law. She is the law incarnate. And just as the Ark of the Covenant carried the staff of Aaron representing the high priesthood, so does Mary now carry the one who is the true great high priest, who makes the perfect sacrifice of offering himself up on Calvary. But most of all, just as the Ark carried the holy presence of God of old, now Mary carries the presence of God made man in her own womb. And I think this has a lot of application for understanding Mary in the Christian life. It helps us understand Mary's important role in our lives as Christians. Because just as the Ark of the Covenant was never worshipped by the Jews, but yet played an important role in the life of the Jews, so Mary is not worshipped by Catholics. We don't worship her like we worship the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but yes, she does play an important role. No Jew of the Old Testament would ever think about just bowing down and worshiping the Ark just for the Ark's own sake. But yet at the same time, no Jew would ever think of just separating themselves from the Ark, saying, I just want a relationship with Yahweh, not the Ark. No, they drew near to the Ark because the Ark brought them near to the presence of God. Similarly, we as Catholics don't bow down and worship Mary like we do the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, But yet at the same time, we don't want to say that I just want a personal relationship with Jesus apart from Mary. No, if Mary's the new Ark of the Covenant, she brings us close to Jesus, just like the Ark brought us close to the holy presence of God. And so we can rejoice with this great biblical title, Mary, the Ark of the Covenant. She's the one that leads us to Jesus and fights our spiritual battles like the Ark of old through her intercession for us now and all the way to the hour of our death.